Welcome to No Church Church this morning. We have Justin Young in with us, businessman and author. Welcome.
Glad to be here. Glad to be back with you.
So glad you're back with us. The last time that we were together, you had podcasted with Ben, and that was a very in-depth, vulnerable conversation. So I kind of want to branch off of that a little bit this morning,
That's
if
good.
that's okay.
That's fine, yeah.
Growing up, there was a lot of law in my life. There was a lot of teaching on control and proper order and hierarchies. And it was almost like that's the natural way of things. That's the way things are always going to be. As a pastor's kid, did you have any similarities to that in your life?
Yeah, well, as far as, I was very aware of, the hierarchy, structure, and order as far as our household went. Dad was the head of the house, and I still believe it's the way it should be. Mom and Dad's working together, but, I'm still probably a little old school. I still believe ultimately that a lot of times would demand that he needs to be taking responsibility as far as that goes and making sure that ultimately the buck stops there and he's taking care of his family and that type of thing. So I very much believe in structure and order and hierarchy, in the home. And we've seen that exemplified greatly through the church back then too. Coming up, we were part of a denomination, so you had your local pastor, and then you had a board inside of the church, and then you had general overseers and overseers for a state. So you had all this hierarchy that was always present and in front of you. When we transitioned out of a major denomination into starting our own church, there wasn't as much law, hierarchy, structure. It didn't go as far. It wasn't as widespread because in starting a church, which when we first started and Dad started the ministry, really he didn't have any quote unquote, as we called it, covering. Okay, there was nobody directly over him because we didn't know nobody that would take us. We were launching out and doing something brand new. He was doing something that was completely foreign from how he was raised, really, as far as traditional church and how you come up in that process. And basically had the opportunity inside of his denomination, was offered multiple churches, and in that denomination, really, because I remember being a kid and going with him, to what they would do is kind of test run you and see if the board liked you at a church. And so they'd book you in to preach, or the general overseer or the overseer for the state would have you go and, preach, and they'd kind of test the waters, and the people would taste you and see whether they liked it or not, and then you'd wait and hear a week later and they'd make a decision. But all that, I remember coming up, when the many times Dad would do that when it was looking like it was time, because he started as an evangelist, then you're supposed to take a pastorate, but they start you off, just to be honest, with crappy churches, it's ones where they're already struggling, or they're, it's a little small town and it's a handful of people, and a lot of times once you get in there you realize that there's a lot of issues, which is why the church is struggling. I remember one particular church he sent us to, sent Dad to and preached, and then they would always take the pastor back, the board would, after he got done preaching, and basically just grill him, ask him all these tons of questions. And this one guy, this always stood out to me, he told my dad, he said, you could tell he was kind of the head elder or head honcho. He told him, he said, well, Brother Dale, he said, I don't know how you react to this, he said, but and let me back up and say they done told him how great the parsonage was, and there was pecan orchards on the parsonage, and he could have all of them he wanted, but just know that the members would be in the yard from time to time getting. But this is how, this is how it went back then. And so, but he looked at him and said, listen, he said, now if I'm eating T-bone steak, I want you to know what it's like to eat T-bone steak. He said, but if all I got is collard greens and I have to eat collard greens, I want you to know what that's like too and be okay with that, So it was that kind of, it's like the mafia kind of deal, or whatever. But in coming up, so being part of all that, even in denomination, I was very aware of hierarchy, structure, rules. And of course, in that denomination, the pastor certainly was not the boss, so to speak.
Right.
But in all those situations, I think those when Dad would go and he'd sit before them boards, he would realize that he was foreign from that. In other words, he was an alien in a weird land where he didn't belong, and none of that ever felt right. And he turned down the churches that would have took him, that wanted him. And I believe, best I remember, they all wanted to hire him after those, dates with him where he'd preach, and they decided where they wanted him. But it was something just always rubbed him wrong, and he just knew that wasn't him, that wasn't his thing. And I think that's some of the stuff that helped lead him and kind of pushed him out of a denomination, started our own church. And we really didn't have a lot of hierarchy or structure other than he was the pastor for many years. Later became part of a more loosely related fellowship where it was more relationship-based, which I believe was a much better way to do church, obviously, if you're going to do it. And a lot of success in that model for a lot of years. But over time, time reveals all things. And over time, whether it was a season that worked, or whatever, but even that to a certain extent, as great as that worked, because it was supposed to be not rule-based, relationship-based, love-based. But as I talked about on the last podcast, you go through some difficult times. It'll often reveal how good of a product you think, whether the product you think you got is that good or not. And so time kind of told on that situation too. And so, hierarchy and structure, I think, is it's a needed thing, especially in business. I'm a business guy, but I think it can get real sticky when it comes to church.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that. So you spent some time pastoring back in the day, like way back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
How did that look for you? Would you say that there was a lot of law in that? How did it go from living under law for so many years to preaching out of that? Or have you been more grace-bent most of your life?
I wouldn't say I was more grace-bent, because I was, not that I went around verbalizing judgment on people or to people, but I was very much, now looking back especially, I was very much law-minded. These are the things you do, this is what you don't do.
Right.
And I talked about that, the last time I was on here, I remembered being in a store and my mom probably don't even remember that, but there's certain little things when I was younger I remember seeing a guy that had long hair and a necklace on, and thinking he was going to hell because he had long hair and a necklace. And I'm a young guy, I'm probably kindergarten, first grade, something like that. Now, whether it was Sunday school that I was at, my Sunday school teacher, the different pastors we'd have in, because at that time our denomination was starting to get a little more liberal, but there was still a lot of old school, old school stuff going on with a lot of the older people that were still in it that had not transitioned out. So you kind of got a mix back then, and so I was very much law oriented in my thinking, because I remember growing up as a child and even up into my mid-teenage years, I thought, if I saw somebody smoking a cigarette, you was not a Christian. There was no way you could be a Christian to smoke a cigarette. You can't get that from the Bible, but that's what was preached to us. But, go back 30 years from when I was a kid, and they thought my grandmother couldn't wear rings and be sanctified and be holy. My grandmother that's still alive, my dad's mom, back then all the men went to one side of the altar and the women went to the other. Okay, you couldn't intermingle in the altar. So the men had their sides, the left side, if you're facing the stage. All the women went to the right. Women prayed for women, men prayed for men. We can't pray for each other. We might start sleeping together.
Oh my gosh.
Okay. So, my dad's told this story, and this was before my time. But she was in the altar, and they was praying for her to receive the Holy Ghost. Okay, which in our denomination you didn't have it without the evidence of speaking in tongues. And that's back when they would tarry. They'd tarry with you. The tarrying could go to bed. It could go to however long it took until you till you caught the Holy Ghost, catch him, which was speaking in tongues. But so while she's crying, a sincere work of the Lord by her testimony on it, and I would like to go back and actually ask her about this, because it's been years since I've heard about it. But by her own testimony, hearing my dad tell it, I mean, she's crying, there's something legitimately happening there as far as, spiritual experience. Lord, His Holy Spirit's moving on her. She's in the altar. But now back in the altar, it was, when that was going on, it was a roar. It's what I call the bulldog squads down there, and it's loud, and everybody around just praying in tongues and bending your head 5 different ways from Sunday. And but they're praying for her to receive the gift of tongues, the Holy Ghost, be sanctified, sanctification. But while her hands is in the air, she always loved jewelry. There's one sister grabs a Kleenex and starts wiping the makeup literally off of her face, and while another one's trying to get the wedding ring off of her finger while she's in the altar. So coming up in that, we were still around a lot of that. A lot of the women, it was long, even though we wasn't Holiness Baptist, which I was third generation. My granddad was never pulpit vocational minister, but I was third generation, basically, classical Pentecostal, raised preacher. And so my great grandfather was a very well-known pastor, 4 different churches, Holiness Baptist pastor that ended up going into the Church of God, which got us into that denomination. I still don't know all that story. He became so hurt and disgruntled, he got out of the ministry before he ever passed away. And of course, my dad, Church of God. So we come up, our whole lineage was from a very much traditional, law-oriented, long skirts, no makeup. To the day my grandmother died, no makeup. Great-grandmother, bun on her head, me, ma. And so that's how we was raised. It was a lot of stuff. My great-granddaddy, who I was talking about, her, great-grandmother passed away, Pearl Moore, what she passed away as she'd remarried, but, same deal with her. But my granddad, who was the pastor that she was married to for so many years, he felt like sweet tea had become too much of a stronghold in his life, because he couldn't work without thinking about sweet tea, and with such a heart to please the Lord and not hurt him. My daddy talks about this. He gave up sweet tea, one of the things he loved. It's not alcohol we're talking about here, it's sweet tea, okay? And went the rest of his life, I don't know how many years, never touched another drop of sweet tea, because he felt convicted over sweet tea, And what that shows his heart. Great man. My dad, he was my dad's hero. And he passed away before I was born, so I never got to know him. But also, while it shows what a great heart he has, it shows, to me, my perspective is the bondage in thinking that, if you need to give it up for health reasons or something like that, that's one thing. But I think the way he was raised and the church tells you is, if anything becomes, if you're thinking about it too much, it's a god to you or something all of a sudden. So it's kind of two sides of that coin, but very much, I come up aware of the law. I would mentally, I might not would tell you, but I'd judge in a heartbeat, And an aspect of that too with the ministry is, that's one thing, man, I look back and I'm so glad I'm free of, because when you was in the ministry, like somebody new would come to the church, and you'd love them and like them, but then if they start, because you're in ministry, if they start missing services pretty regularly, or if you realize they're not tithing every Sunday anymore, all that, then I'm looking at them people with disdain for them, because they're not supporting ministry. You know what I'm saying? And that's how I was. In the ministry, when that's your livelihood, and it's your family's livelihood, and you grow up in it, and it's not just about, when I say livelihood, about that's where your paycheck comes from, although that does have a lot of bearing on your outlook. It's just natural, it's going to. But because you do take ownership in it and you help build it, and it's like your business, it's your baby and all this, when people that are members are not paying their dues, so to speak, they're not helping carry the load as a member, they're not waving the flag as high as you think they need to wave it, then you that are, whether you're laity but really involved in the ministry, or you're a vocational pastor on staff there, it causes you to look down at the people because you got inside information. Whereas the average parishioner may not know or care that you missed that Sunday, because he might have been out too, and he don't look at the records, and he don't know who gives and who doesn't. So it causes you to take a lot of things personal. You carry all this unseen weight of judgment on people that you'd really rather not have, you know. And that's the great thing about it is now I don't care where you go to church, how often you go to church, if you go, you know, because all that's not tied to something I build or how I make my living. And like I talked about in the last podcast, it can be handled differently than a business. You know, business is a business. If it don't work out, you're not a member. You didn't come out. You're there to make a check. We can get rid of you if something don't go right. You know, it's very cut and dry to a certain extent. Although there is loyalties we expect, and we can be hurt by people that work for us that we got close to, it's still not as fierce as all that from the ministry side. But I was very much law-based, really up until probably about 12 years ago.
Really?
11 or 12 years ago.
So is there one specific point in time that you remember God's grace just becoming very evident to you?
For me, it was probably the divorce and getting out of the ministry all at the same time when I did that, which was, you know, it's 11 years ago, so whenever. When I look back, like I talked about the last podcast I was on, when I went through that dark season, I think ultimately it was an inner wrestling with my humanity, my knowing that, or feeling like I was called to preach and be in the ministry. Plus, this is what we've always done. But the internal struggle of knowing I didn't want that for the rest of my life, and was I going to be letting God down, letting my family down, letting people's expectations down of me, because that was my brand. I was known as, I was Mr. Church, you know what I'm saying? And so that's what I loved, lived, ate it, slept it, breathed it, ministry. And so that kind of being what was associated, that had become my identity. So now I'm faced with, which I think sent me through that dark time and the depression that I dealt with, is inside, because you don't feel like you can go to nobody with that. You know, I can't go to my dad, closest person to me, because I want to let him down. You know, and so trying to deal with all that internally, which ultimately, you know, I obviously went through a divorce, got out of the ministry right there at the same time. We were transitioning away from the church that we had founded anyhow, and Dad was taking on a new one. So there was like a loss there. It felt like a death, because you felt like you'd put all that work in and you're never going to see any fruit from it, get anything back from it any longer. And I'm very much a business type, even back then, oriented person. I don't want to put time and effort into something that's not going to continue to have a benefit that is at least somewhat controllable by the people that started it, because we knew the intent. Okay. But ultimately, that was all. Any transitional things that happened there with that ministry was Dad's decision, because I'm VP. I'm not the president on that deal. Okay. So anyhow, that, you know, just in a lack of feeling of control and where all that deal was going. So all that kind of happening at one time, and that explosion and me resetting on life. When it all happened, and here's what I realized. It provided an opportunity. First off, I seen my earthly dad in a light of softness and gentleness and grace and mercy that I had probably never seen to that level. Now, let me qualify that. Never was he a tyrant or hateful or mean or ugly, as we say in South Georgia, to any of us kids. He always loved us through whatever we went through. But in my personal mind, what I went through and what I'd done and how I reacted to what life threw at me was the ultimate scarlet letter on my chest kind of deal. And so going through that, in other words, where I had that, everything I'd done mentally, where I had myself at was unredeemable kind of, because of my own view and how I had been to other people. It's easy to judge people's lives when you ain't lived enough yet. That's what I tell 20-somethings all the time that work for me, these 21 to 25-year-olds, especially 27-year-old. it's, you just ain't lived enough yet. You hadn't had your teeth kicked in enough. You hadn't went through enough up and downs. You hadn't experienced enough life. You've just not lived enough to know. And so going through that situation, when I, it's going on, it's kind of like I'm a slow motion in an action movie going through a horrible wreck, and I'm taking shots, and I'm getting hit, and the car's flipping. I'm like, okay, but I thought that would have killed me. I'm not dead yet. I'm still alive, I'm still breathing, and I'm going through all this stuff, and then the car finally stops rolling, and the wreck's over, and like I'm beat up, I'm damaged, but I'm still standing. My parents still love me. I realized that I still feel loved by God, and actually, the wreck was kind of like the pressure coming off of the pressure cooker. Like once the wreck was over, because I'd been pissed off with God the whole time during the wreck, So once the wreck's over, then it was kind of like all the pressure was off, and like it was almost like a release. Mm-hmm. I'm not mad at him anymore. Now the religious bunch don't like me, but the fact of the matter is they probably didn't like me when they pretended to like me. Okay, it's funny how when people have to be associated with you, how they'll react and respond to you and act out in your life, and then when they don't have to no more, they're able to just be them, Mm-hmm. And a lot of people's nasty to just be. There's a lot of good in the world, but there's a lot of nasty too. And so, but that was kind of that wreck right there that happened right around 2010, into 9, beginning of 10. That was the event that revealed to me that God loves me and I'm going to be okay no matter what. And it was an event that was so based on, a lot of people go through that kind of stuff off and on their whole life. I come up white picket fence. We didn't go through nothing like that. Mm-hmm. Okay. Not that we didn't have our problems, but there wasn't no major catastrophes you could see outside the household usually. Okay. And so that being something visible for everybody that was in our arena and circle to see, going through it, feeling disgraced publicly to a certain extent, all that. But when you get to the other side, you realize life goes on. A lot of people don't care. And the people that know that don't care, a lot of people don't know and will never know. And the people that did know that meant the most to me loved me through it anyhow. And so you get done, your wounds heal up. Takes a little time from the wreck you went through, and then you're like, mm-hmm. It was kind of the unveiling of everything that I thought I had to be loved and to be accepted by God. I don't have to do. And as far as being loved and accepted by people, who the hell cares if they don't all love you and accept you?
Exactly.
But when you're in the ministry, they got to love you and accept you because, again, you got this measuring stick on you where you can't be human. They can be human all day long, and they can have problems, but because you're clergy, and you quote unquote strap the collar on, you have to. There's a different set of, and let me clarify that too. Leadership is held to a higher responsibility in anything. I am not negating that. Okay, mm-hmm. With leadership comes responsibility. Bottom line, but the extreme that I think the churches took it to for their leaders does their leaders more harm, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, than it does good. It's an extreme. Okay, do you have to be mindful of when you're in leadership? Let's not have to be mindful. I can't, leading a company, I can't do some of the things that other people inside of my company would do because it's just, they might be able to be a little out here on the fringe sometimes with some things. I can't do that, mm-hmm. Because I do believe that, to a certain extent, I've heard this quote before and I don't agree with all of it, but, with whatever I'm trying to think how to word it, but with whatever the fathers do, in a sense of liberality, the sons could take and will take in some cases to excess. So I don't think that's a cookie cutter for everybody like it was preached to me coming up in ministry. But I do believe you do have to be mindful because sometimes some people might see you doing something and they don't have the discipline that you have. So you still have to be mindful and intuitive about who you're dealing with. So I don't think that's carte blanche. If you're a preacher today, you should be able to go do what anybody and everybody does and never be judged for it by people. I think that's stretching it too far the other way too. Mm-hmm. But I think we hurt our leaders because we don't allow them to be human inside the church.
Yeah, I would agree with that completely. And it's, for me personally, it's heartbreaking to see the standard that they're held to like that. It leads into my next thing, which is what I really would love to talk to you about today. One thing that I'm really passionate about is people sharing the stories that they carry. And you've shared some good ones with us today, especially stories of transformation and change in beliefs. For me, personally, my beliefs started changing about 4 years ago. Like, I can pinpoint the exact moment in time when it happened. And it was like a small change happened. And then I overcame that, and another small change happened until here I am. And I've pretty much reconstructed all of my beliefs at this point in time. And some people would call it a deconstruction. Some people call it an unraveling. But I like to call it an undoing. Mm-hmm. Anything that comes undone is going to be put back together again. Right. So was there one specific area that started an undoing of a very strong belief that you carried?
There was I would point probably to two times. Initially, about 2003, when I began to see some people that I had held high as leaders in the church begin to accept the grace message, which to some extent went to what we call universal reconciliation, or if you want to call it the gospel of inclusion, whatever you want to call it. So that opened up some thinking for me, even though I felt like a heretic for even opening up to listen to 5 minutes of something,
Right.
But it did cause me to think, because I had put a lot of faith and trust into years and years and years, even though I didn't have a personal relationship with a lot of these people. I did have a great admiration for their leadership and what they had built. And even though I was raised more of, when somebody does wrong like that, you don't need to be open thinking about it. It's just that's wrong because I don't agree with what we said. And I'm not saying this was taught to me necessarily directly, but to open your brain up and to question thoughts, or even to question questions and question answers, you just didn't do.
Right. Because
here's the Bible. This is the Logos, the Word of God. You don't question it. Now, albeit it's our own interpretation of an interpretation that we've made an absolute law. So I'll go ahead and make this statement that'll probably upset a lot of people. But I don't believe the Word of God is so much the Logos, Greek translation of the Word, as it is man's inspired word about God. So to go back and make that clearer, I no longer believe so much that the Bible is the inspired word of God, rather that the Bible is man's inspired word about God. Now, the problem with the people that'll have issue with what I just said is that they've never studied any different. They'll rip, roar, raise hell, and yell at me and, raise the pitchfork and want to run you out of town. But when you ask them, what study have you done? What have you went back? What church history have you studied? What have you studied about the canonization of the 66 books? What have you went back and looked at? The 99.999% of them don't got a leg to stand on, because it's the blind leading the blind. All they know is what they've been told, and they don't have to read their Bible through the week no how. All they're doing, they base their beliefs off whatever man behind a pulpit has stood and told them over and over again. I still to this day have people, they quote stuff as scripture that's literally not in the Bible, but there's just common stuff in the church. My dad addresses some of that in that book he wrote, Misheard in Church, but so much stuff that people regurgitate as being Scripture, and it's not even in there. It's just stuff that sounds good that preachers have perpetuated years and years and years, indoctrinated and added salt and pepper to it, and that's what it is. So, so looking back, I mean, in 2003, I began to at least question, why would these people give up everything? Because until you're into ministry and know what you give up, it's real easy to say, well, yeah, I can believe that privately, but there's no need to go public with it, because really, what good is it going to do anyhow? And I'm going to lose all of this, and I'm probably going to be jobless, And these people that were doing this had a lot to lose. So I first started kind of opening my mind to it at that point, and just as a point of, really, like, I'm trying to figure out why they decided to become a heretic kind of deal. What is it? What's the deal? So over the course of the next 8-9 years, I would read, watch, listen. I felt like sacrilegious. I wouldn't read the books that had been written by the people once they had read books, or written books. I just wouldn't read it because I felt like I'd be hurting God's heart somehow, But when I went through my deal and I realized I was still standing, and I got that great, basically, revelation of the grace of God, and it didn't matter what man's interpretation was about what I'd done. What overcome all of that was the love I still felt by Him, by the Father. And then kind of the crowning moment was when I had my own kid. Because when you hold that kid in your arms, because you always, throughout the ministry, you heard all of these, everybody always talks about God as being your father and us as children, and you hear all of this parable type talk exemplified between fathers and their children. And you got all these same parents that would literally, I know parents that have bailed their children out of jail, God knows how many times, for doing the same thing over and over. And I'm talking about bad mess.
Yeah, me too.
I mean, ridiculous mess, and they fight for their kid. I mean, I know some of these mothers, I've sat in the counseling chambers with them, would literally lay down, die, take a bullet for their kids so their kid could keep committing debauchery over and over and over again. That kind of love. Times I've wanted to say, I might be grace bent, but you might need to let them sit in the tank, a while, because this is just insanity. Same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. You're killing your own self financially trying to do all this for this kid that's never going to change. It's basically just spitting in your face. But that type of mother's love or father's love that just continually, again and again, to go after the one, so to speak. I mean, they just keep going. And so having your own children and realizing what that actually feels like, and never wanting them to hurt, go without, do without, be without. And as much as they would mess up, I can't ever imagine turning them away and wanting them to suffer. Now, they may suffer some due to the own things that they do in life, okay? Pain that they caused themselves here. But it's not going to be because I caused the suffering. And I'm never going to see suffering and not come and try to remedy it. What type of tyrant would I be? If it's my kid, putting her hand because she's crawling across the counter on a hot stove. So now listen, don't you learn from this now? I mean, what, go and do it again. You'll get burnt. I mean, no. And now there's people that probably talk like that, but they're sick. Or whether it's my teenager going out behind our back and doing something wrong, for the second or third time. What good is it going to do me to cut them off and say, well, you got there and just sleep in the street then? I mean, love casts out all fear. Why want to add fear to them when there's technically something already? I mean, they're already afraid. There's already something that's caused them to make poor decisions in their life. So the only leadership, the only safe house, safe covering they got is me as a parent, and I'm going to turn on them too. There's nothing in me once I had my own kids that I could ever see God doing that to His creation. And so for me, when the seal on the deal was when all of this I'd heard all these years, but I didn't have an experience to back it up. Okay, I'd heard all God is your Father, loves His children, come to seek and save that which was lost. Okay. And I've been through all that. Well, when I finally had an experience to put with all that,
Mm-hmm.
and my dad used to always use the example, on the whole once saved, always saved thing, because he'd always ruffle a lot of feathers because we couldn't Pentecostalism. That wasn't the case. You cussed and this rapture happened right after you cussed. It's do not pass go, do not collect. You're going straight to hell.
Right.
Serve God all your life, but if you cuss right before the rapture happens, you're going because the grace ain't sufficient for that because you messed up. So what he would always use years before he even accepted the grace message was he'd say, yeah, we're once saved, always saved. And he'd always say, if you got saved like I did, and that kind of made it apropos. But he believed that back then, and that's what he'd say. Your children, if they flick your bird and say screw you and run off to Mexico and live in a hut somewhere, and spit in your face on the way out, nothing changes the fact that kid living in the thatch roof hut in Mexico is still your kid.
Exactly.
Either they came from you or they did not.
Mm-hmm.
You can't say they're not. You can say they're not your kid, but they're your kid. They got your DNA. Mm-hmm. They were born of you. So if they're born of you and they're your kid, they're still your kid. And so when I had my daughter, and I experienced some of that with the two boys I became dad of overnight already, but it is a little different when it was actually from your loins, okay? But when I held that little girl, I realized, how can I make God worse than me, mere flesh? And so that was the sealing of the deal for me on that.
Yeah. That's been the same story for me pretty much. Was I feel like my kids hit it home for me almost. And one thing that I emphasize with them all the time, and I've said on the podcast, is I always let them know that there's nothing they can do that will make me stop loving them. There's nothing they can do that would separate them from me. And if God says that to me, and he means, it's just exponentially more powerful than the words that I say to my kids, I feel like. If I say that to my kids and he sings that over us, how is there any room for it to not include all?
Right.
And for me personally, my journey started, they say that there's all these different pillars that start to fall when you question your belief. Mm-hmm. And mine started with all the end times hype. From the time that I was really young, it's all I heard, because I was born in the 80s. So, that's when it was really hitting the fan hardcore. And it's just all I heard. And there was so much fear behind it. And then I just lost it a few years ago. I just completely broke down because there was so much fear, and I didn't know how to live out from under that fear. And so the Lord walked me through that, and then the revelation of hell looking differently came into my life, and then the revelation of grace, and it's progressed from there so much. But I would say more intensely in this last year than any other time throughout the 4 years. For me, it's been so much freedom that's been found, just by looking at God differently than I've ever looked at him before in my life. And I know I've spoke with you a little bit in the past about different people, you've recommended books to me and things like that, and they've been monumental in helping me walk this process out. Is there anyone in particular that you followed when you first started questioning your belief, and even now that?
Well, the majority of that I followed was all from Bishop Carlton Pearson, in which. So I had heard, being around and in the ministry world, I had heard of people that were in quote unquote more liberal denominations moving into universal reconciliation, new thought.
Right.
Okay. That was pretty common. And we all had them over here in you don't got the true gospel box anyhow. Okay?
Exactly.
If you was Lutheran or Episcopal, Catholic, anyway, I won't name anymore, but I mean, if you were those denominations, we already had you wrote off anyhow,
We really did.
Yeah, and so, but you heard about, priests and bishops and ministers from those organizations more commonplace. Until Bishop Pearson, I had never heard of anybody that came out of, ORU, Azusa, Mr. Azusa, from our heritage, classical Pentecostalism, charismatic. I'd never heard of anybody moving into that. And so that was real eye-catching for me. So I watched him, and he was my flavor too, okay? Because there's a lot about classical Pentecostalism, church, and all that I still love, okay? I still love the art of preaching. I still watch preachers, and I still know how to do it if I needed to. And, but there's a lot of that I love. I grew up loving camp meeting and Sunday morning and, the excitement of Sunday morning and, church happening. And I was always bent more towards, and I'm kind of a mutt. I joke about, I was talking with Dr. Benny Calloway. We went to lunch last week. He's been on and going to be on y'all's podcast again. And Benny's he's one of the most eloquent speakers and as far as personally that I know, one of the best free thinkers, theologians, I would consider him, of anybody personally I've known. I mean, he really is. And so, we were talking. I had lunch with him last week, and I said, I'm just a lot of people. I'm kind of a mutt because I grew up part of so many camps. We ate from and were part of the Word of Faith camp to a certain extent. And then we come up classical Pentecostal. So we've got that whole flair too. Hooping and sweating and B3 Hammond B3. Organ wailing in the background. And I still love all that, and I like church to feel like church. I told somebody the other day, if I did church again, I don't know, I would want it to feel churchy, but then be free at the same time, But I like all that. I like a lot of that. I like to get dressed up. I wore the collars, even though my dad would roll his eyes probably at some of it. Sometimes I'd throw a collar on, and I like the organ wailing in the background. And I still love all that to this day. I mean, I got an app called, it's a hoop app on my phone. I can run through my Sonos system, and I can back myself up with a band. I'll be preaching to the kids around the house. And my wife, everybody laughs at me and don't understand why I like it. I paid $59 for the app so I can have a band back me up when I'm getting on to the kids around the house. But that's just me, It's the flair of all that I like. But then we were also part of the whole prophetic movement, and probably more closely related most of our years in ministry, Rick Joyner and Morning Star, and I was involved and knew a lot of them people, stayed in their homes. I mean, I got all kinds of stories I can tell you. And that was kind of during my musician era, but a lot of great experiences, a lot of great stuff come from all of that, coming up and all that. But I mean, with the whole classical Pentecostal type upbringing, just tons of experiences. And what was your initial question on that again?
Asking about influences.
So with those influences, I mean, that because of that, that was kind of my vein. That was my preference. It was how Carlton Pearson done ministry, and then him being the first one from that vein to kind of make a break. That was my biggest one. Now later on, and much later on, of course, I read his books and all eventually, but then Rob Bell, Love Wins is a great book for anybody that if you just even want to have a little light thought about any of these issues on universal reconciliation, I'd highly recommend Love Wins and what is it, Velvet Elvis.
Yeah, it's a good one.
So I mean that. There's some good entry books, those, and then of course Carlton's Gospel of Inclusion, and then God's Not a Christian. Those are some great books. If you want to dare to open your brain a little bit and question, which for a lot of people still is a sacrilegious act, but
well, it's uncomfortable too. I know for me, like I am very analytical, so it was like, what are you doing? Yeah. Is this safe? Yeah. Are you going to hell? Are you making bad choices?
And it's still, and what I've learned is it is okay to not have everything figured out.
Exactly, and that has been more freeing than almost anything.
It's
is
like
being
I
able
tell
to say
people in
that.
our business. I mean, it's like it's a Mario Andretti quote, but I mean, if you go in, if you go in fast enough, I mean, you're not going to have everything under control. If you've got everything under control, you're not going fast enough. And I believe that even now. I mean, I don't have to have everything under control in my life, in my spiritual life, in my thought process. It's okay to just get in the car and drive and go fast and see. I mean, you learn how to eat around a bone, get it figured out. And just to be clear, I mean, I still believe on Jesus and what he did on the cross.
Absolutely.
His finished work. I still believe that is the avenue by which this freedom and free gift come to the world, whether you're Muslim, Hindu, whatever. Okay, that gift came from you, and I believe it came through Jesus. I'm not so open in my thought to say that this freedom would be here without that act. Okay, but I'm much more concerned with what Jesus said about Jesus in the New Testament than what the church has told us about Jesus. I'm more concerned with what he said about himself, what he was, than what the church for the past hundreds of years has preached through their own skewed personal preferences about who he is. And there's a big difference in the two. So,
absolutely. I agree completely. Now that you're living in grace, how's it received? Do you get a lot of pushback?
I really don't. I mean, I feel like there's probably a ton of opinions on me. I don't get a whole lot of pushback just because I don't really think nobody wants to push back a whole lot because I'm pretty triple type A. So I get told sometimes people scared to come to me with things, whatever, and I'm kind of like, why? And my wife's like, well, you're a little bit intimidating sometimes. I don't necessarily see that in myself, but I'm very forward. I'll tell you what I think. I'll tell you how it is, and I'll tell you, I'm just going to tell you. So I feel like probably maybe I'm not as approached sometimes. There'll probably be some great internet theologian that might hear this and think he'd want to bow up. If he does, he can knuck if you buck, But I mean, I don't know. I don't get a lot of pushback. I mean, people leave me alone for the most part, and I'm fine with it if somebody wants to not leave me alone with it. I've not received a lot of it, but I mean, if you think my soul's in danger and you care enough about me, then bring it. I mean, we may walk away agreeing to disagree, but the fact of the matter is especially in church, you got a lot of pit bull mouths with chihuahua butts. This fact, I mean, they'll talk all day long about how you ain't right and where you ain't got it, but ain't nobody got enough butt to come tell you,
Yeah.
So, but anyhow, that's kind of funny. And that's life in general. Most people's like that. People's real opinionated and real brave behind a keyboard and real quiet if they have to see you.
Yeah.
Keyboard
for
warriors.
Sure. For sure. So what do you see as the next step for the church?
I think church is going to continue to be church. I think I think we got another probably 15, 20 years with a lot of the mega churches, just because I got so much momentum. And a lot of them's ran right. You can't run if an organization becomes large and stays large, it's because they got large leaders, large budgets, and they do things in a large way, and they know what they're doing. Okay? If you're not a good farmer, you're not going to have any fruit. Okay? So if you know what you're doing and that's working for people, then God bless you. It's great, and I mean, there's a lot of churches doing a lot of good. I mean, there's some articles that's out there right now where mega churches has paid off the entire medical debt for the whole congregation. Man, that stuff's phenomenal. It's what we should have been doing the whole time. I'm all about it with that kind of deal. So nothing about me being on the No Church podcast is anti-church.
Right.
And if that makes you feel fulfilled and you like getting up on Sunday morning and you like going, or you need that in that type of structure as opposed to gathering with a small group once a week or what, you know what I'm saying? What I'm anti is all the boxes, and you saying because this is my box, this has to be your box, and vice versa, and then we all pissed off at each other because we in different boxes. We just need to tear down the boxes, trust that God's big enough to see through all the boxes. He's big enough to touch people's life. He's big enough to lead them in love as to what they need for that season. Okay? Personally, I don't feel like I need to be in church every Sunday at where I'm at in life right now. Now, I'm still there every Sunday I'm in town. But you know, I don't feel that I need that. And I'm still there for now, and I got my reasons for being there. And, you know, but the day will probably come that I'm not there every Sunday. And you know, and I don't know if I got back involved in church where I'd be. There's part of me that would really just like to go see a lot of stuff I've never seen church-wise, you know. I'd like to go to some masses. I'd like to go to some Lutheran churches. I'd like to chill with the Episcopals a little while and sip a little wine, you know what I'm saying? We used to call them Whiskapayans. And, no offense to any of you Episcopals, because I probably drink more wine than all y'all now. But no, I mean, it's, you know, I'm just anti all the judgment on everybody. I mean, just let people be people. Let them live. I mean, God's either got all this or he don't, you know. And so I just trust in what he's already done, what he's accomplished. I do think we need to encourage people into Christ consciousness, which is just an understanding and a realization of what Christ has already done. I believe their lives will go easier for them and be better. They'll feel less condemned and more loved. And when you feel better, you perform better. You know what I'm saying? And meaning that, you know, and just to use a business analogy, I used this on a podcast the other day, but, you know, I watched a special with Deion Sanders, and he was saying, you know, when you look good, you feel good, and when you feel good, you play good, and when you play good, they pay good, okay? Or you can take pay to perform in life, okay? And the bottom line is, you know, let's just take it from feel. When you feel good in life, you're going to always perform good, and when you perform good in life, there's going to be more increased resources. Things in your life is going to go better, all because you felt good. And when you feel good, you're going to perform good. Now, I'm not saying we need to perform in our faith, but my point is, if you feel good about your faith and what you're doing and what you're in, and you feel at peace and you're not walking around feeling condemned, and you know that you're loved by God, okay, and accepted by Christ. When you have that feeling, and that it all starts from there, from that inner root of just extreme peace and knowledge and what he's already, and it's not on you. You can't mess it up. And when from that foundation, everything that flows from it is going to be productive. And when everything that flows from that is productive, you don't have to worry about the pay, so to speak. In other words, if you're productive, you're producing something. Something's coming from it. So I'm talking about down to your personal finances in your life. I know you've been preached at that it's because you didn't give enough, but maybe it's because you didn't believe right.
That's good.
So,
that's really good. Well, thank you so much for coming on with us today.
Glad to be on here.
I appreciate it. I'm sure it's probably not going to be the last time.
Probably not. It's fun. This is the first avenue I've had to talk about church stuff. I'm not churchy enough for church podcasts anymore, and or Christian enough, or whatever you would want to call it. So I get all the time talk about business on business podcasts and radio shows, and I've had no avenue for this, so it's kind of fun. I'm enjoying it, and as my Meemaw would say, I'm on here just messing and gomming. So
that's awesome. Well, that's the whole purpose behind it, is for there to be a place for all. So we really appreciate you coming on with us today, sharing with us a little bit.
Yeah, we'll do it again.
Sounds great. Until next time.